Hello and welcome to Varn Vlog. And today we are talking with Nico Villareal about all kinds of stuff, but mostly your recent letter that you did in response to an article called Eco-Leninism, which itself is a response to Climate Leviathan, that book from a few years back. And you tackle the parts of eco-leninism that seem to pick up some common degrowth issues. Now, I'm on the record as thinking the whole Promethean socialism versus degrowth argument is, or bright green versus deep green in some ways, is often very misleading because I'm not sure what actually the what the vectors of growth are, what they're actually trying to achieve. And the last book by Sato, which is the first one that isn't just Marxology, made me go oh, that's it, that's all you meant. Like, so, but these misunderstandings kind of go through a lot of the degrowth and actually also the people responding to them negatively's analysis. So I wanted to have you on to talk about that since you wrote a letter in response. So you mentioned three issues, and I'm going to let you talk about them. One is the assumption that human labor time is directly correspondent to material throughput, and that's going to take some parsing. Some people don't even know what we mean by that, but we'll come back to that in a minute. Two, that a reduction in material throughput necessarily means a decline in all economic activity, or the reverse, that a decline in all economic activity would lead to a material throughput decline. And there's a sub mistake on that reducing capitalist consumption will necessarily reduce all economic activity. And three, assuming that the transformation of relations of production is only a matter of political will. Now, that last one's a biggie, so we'll come back to that. So can you explain those and why they're important?
Sure. So the first one which one was the first one? Was it the economic throughput and
yeah, assuming that human labor time is directly correlated to material throughput. So right. What do we mean by that?
Labor time. Yeah. So the thing is that a common thing that comes up in every degrowth thing, which does have at least some basis in fact, but it's a little bit exaggerated, a lot exaggerated, as I point out, is that one way that we can have a sustainable economy and less growth, everyone's better off, is just that people work less. And the idea behind that is that if we just work less, we have more free time, which materially improves our lives. But we're decreasing the economic activity. What they're thinking of is material throughput, using all the energy inputs and whatnot. The problem with that thinking is related to specifically the way that productivity gains affect labor time in capitalism. So what the part of the thinking of that is that capitalists will employ more labor than they need to, because that's how they create value. It's also a thing of social domination and status, but the main thing is that you need human labor to create value. And the idea is that, well, if all of that's just unnecessary because it's capital's logic and a capitalist drive for profit, then we can just cut that down and solve all these problems. The issue with that is that almost all of that labor time that is being freed up by productivity increases is going into not creating more stuff, even though more stuff does get created because of the productivity increases. It goes to the service sector. Mm-hmm. And because that labor is in the service sector, it's not going to affect the material throughput when you decrease it. So if you decide to so if you decide, well, we're going to decrease labor in the industry sectors, well, the reason that people are laboring in the service sector is that they have enough value to exchange for the commodities that they consume, that is to reproduce themselves. And that group of commodities that people use is all produced by industry and agriculture. And the decreasing those means that you decrease the consumption bundles of everyone in society. And that's a real problem. That is a material decline in living standards. It's not just if you decrease just the service sector, it's not affecting material throughput. If you actually affect it, you are going to affect people's living standards significantly.
Okay. A lot of degrowthers would immediately respond to that, but we need to affect people's living standards, particularly those in the developed West. That's, the going argument. What's the problem with that line of thinking for you?
Well, it's not necessarily false. And this will relate to some of the arguments made at the end of the piece, of the letter, is that, yes, we need to figure out ways to rationalize consumption bundles, and that's will probably be necessary for humanity's continued existence down the line. But trying to do that in capitalism with the existing systems of production and reproduction that we have will be pretty disastrous and just won't work. If you look at instances where we have seen declines in material throughput, and specifically in fossil fuels and stuff, if you look at like Germany, right as the Ukraine war was going off, or China around the same time, but for different reasons, it was trying to do what degrowthers want, specifically of cutting down coal production. Like they introduced quotas for that, and it led to severe shortages that were just not sustainable. And they cut down on industrial production first. They just protect the households, but it just wasn't a sustainable situation. And so if you want to control consumption bundles, and also relatedly get out of the problems of I forget what it's called exactly, when you have greater efficiency, consumption increases. It's Walras paradox, or one of those economists, and you need some kind of social system of that is able to control the consumption bundles that socially reproduce households or whatever unit of people that you want.
Okay.
But beyond that, but there's still another level before that. And this is kind of the thing that people are in denial about. That the big thing that we need to do is investment in new systems that are capable of reproducing society without destroying it like it is right now, right? And I was reading a little bit of Saito, or how do you say it? Is it
I think it's Saito.
And it was the book, the Ecological Socialism book that you were reading for Radical Engagements. And one of the things that struck me, that I realized, was that the whole problem with the Promethean socialism versus the degrowth thing is that Saito has it exactly backwards. That the Promethean socialism is the only way to do it, for the reason, like, he goes through this whole argument about how the specific logic of capital requires this extending growth and the constant expansion of the productive forces and just is what causing this problem. The issue with that argument is that it's based off of like the ideas of reification and the personification of people, like that people personify commodities and commodity relationships. And this is a very common argument in like big theory Marxism. But the problem with it is that it's fundamentally just wrong in a scientific sense, in the way that Marx meant it. Because he does give a very specific, concrete example. I don't mention this in the letter, but I should probably write it out at some point. That the capitalists personify capital, and in this, they're not just personifying money, capital, expansion, growth. They embody the means of production and the productive forces, and in that self-expansion of the means of production. Mm-hmm. And that embodiment just wasn't true for the entirety of capitalism. It stopped being true in neoliberalism for the simple reason, and Kalecki's profit equations show why, that there is a fundamental mutual exclusivity between capitalist consumption and capitalist investment. And once you hit a point where too much investment endangers the reproduction of the capitalist class, then they no longer personify the self-expansion of the means of production.
I see.
And in that sense, the situation that we see ourselves in right now is that the closest thing we see to like state capitalism in that the logic of capital overcoming itself is probably in China right now.
Right.
And they are the ones that are doing the most investment into those new sectors of solar panels and renewable energy that will be necessary to make this all possible. And in the place where personification has broken down, where the logic of capital is broken down, we actually see the inability in the U.S. So they're trying to overcome it right now. But generally speaking, they were very unwilling to make these investments. And if it actually cuts into the social reproduction of capitals, I expect that it will be politically defeated or forced to transcend to something new. But the fact that that situation is just not compatible with dealing with the ecological crisis.
I suppose this leads me to a couple of questions when I'm thinking about this in the series of throughput and state capital adjustment. I agree with you, for example, and I want people to understand when we say something like state capitalism in China, we're not just using it as a slur. Mm-hmm. Like in Chinese communist theory, they think that the period of state capital is necessary to develop the productive forces and to develop the class so that a dictatorship of the proletariat can be transitioned into. And then you go through that. And they have a very long durée view. I mean, Mao sometimes talked about it as almost it might be 1,000 years before they hit like true socialism. And so Lenin talked about state capitalism too. Unfortunately, because of anarchist use of that term, some left communist use of that term, it took on a moral valence as well as we also Trotskyist used it too, but it was a minority tendency in Trotskyism. It took on a moral valence that it didn't really have in Lenin, or Marx doesn't write that much about it actually, but it is something to think about here, because what the state is doing, the strong state capitalism of China is doing, is trying to force capitalist actors to act responsibly. So as the committee of the bourgeoisie in China, even though it's not primarily by the bourgeoisie, it's primarily, the Chinese Communist Party is mostly made up of professionals. They are leaning really hard on certain elements to try to tamp down on, excesses of competition. And in the West, that happened basically by monopoly granting in what we might call the heroic period of capital that we see from, say, the end of the long Depression into 1920. That, you know, what Bukharin called monopoly capital, not what Baron and Sweezy called monopoly capital, right? Now, for those of you who are not Marx nerds, you're probably like, what are you guys talking about? Well, the issue here is Sato is partly right that capitalist competition for resources necessitates what becomes inefficient use of resources, right? It doesn't start off that way, but it becomes that way. Capitalists themselves realize this and have tried to handle it in various ways. And the Chinese Communist Party tries to handle it in various ways. Like, we have in the West, and particularly in the United States, and to a lesser degree Canada, in the Anglophone North America, have pretty much given up on leaning into that because of the patronage of capitalists, right? I think you and I kind of agree, and that's almost inevitable. Yeah. And people go, well, why? You know, MMT is true or whatever. And I'm like, well, even if you assume MMT is true, like, the currency only has power because it commands access to production. And under capitalism, production requires capitalist. So if the capitalist did a true capital strike, the currency would collapse even under MMT conditions. So,
but I mean, it goes even deeper than that, because in principle, and the collective profit equations show this, and you can think about it abstractly, like you can imagine a situation that when you unhinge capitalist social relations from the logic of capital, in principle, it is possible to have a capitalist class with any situation of growth, in principle, just in like accounting terms, and the problem is that that's not the logic of capital is not even the problem here, and this is like Sato calls, I don't know if it's a subtitle of the book, but he says like an unfinished political economy or critique of political economy or something, right?
Right. Yeah. What I like to call the most important thing in capital is the stuff in the back of a napkin. But go ahead.
Yeah, but that's the thing, is that he's focusing on the incomplete part of those incomplete parts and connecting it back to what Marx originally said. But there was enough about political economy. But the incomplete part of his critique of political economy, of his project of capital, wasn't just that. It was also the theory of the state, right? Mm-hmm. And the part of the problem with Sato is that by just trapping himself within Marxology, he doesn't think about how these parts of things that Marx was able to finish, were also a part of like this metabolic, like metaphor logic thing, in terms of like a control mechanisms and feedback loops, because even if you just assume like the dumb logic of capital, I think Sato is vaguely right. Mm-hmm. That these things are totally incompatible, will destroy humanity, whatever. But in reality, I think it's entirely possible that we can imagine a situation where capitalism survives the current ecological crisis that we're in, and it doesn't immediately destroy humanity in the next 1,000 years or whatever. For the simple reason that, and certainly it's not guaranteed, but the state is able to do things, uses like the creative capabilities of humans, their labor, and all kinds of things. It brings them up to do things that are not necessarily just straightforwardly the logic of capital, and it does them in a response to all the same problems that Sato's identifying. And certainly, like, some things are resolved on themselves. There's new innovations so Sato just talks about, there's elasticity of capital. There's also these innovations that sometimes overcome problems. Right. That's not the only thing that is how capitalism responds to these things. It's also
capitalists impose their own regulations, and so does the state. Like,
yeah, exactly.
So, this is why I think even in what we might call a traditional capitalist society like the United States,
Mm-hmm.
it's impossible at this point to separate the state sector out from the market sector in any meaningful sense at this point. I mean, the interplay of commodities and rents alone mean that the state is highly involved. And while that does lead some people to come up with what I think is fundamental misunderstandings of the past and the present, like techno-neo-feudalism, it is true that means that there's a lot more regulations and rents and the state has grown. And one of the things that you and I have talked about it, but I talk about it a lot on this channel, is when leftists buy as true what neoliberals said they were doing, which was deregulating, privatizing, etc. But what they were actually doing was creating public-private partnerships with, from a neoclassical point of view, tons of moral hazard in them, that were forms of rent seeking in a lot of ways to maintain other kinds of markets. And they did this by breaking up, and this is part of your work, and I want to tie some of your prior work into this, by breaking up large monopolies to reintroduce competition through financialization. That's how they did it. And there's the sloppy, Jack Welch form of it that, just totally destroy everything. But in general, that was happening anyway. So when, I listen to a lot of podcasts and then people go off on how Jack Welch, made capitalism something more, and they're right about that. But without strong state intervention, that was going to happen. Somebody was going to do that because the numbers game of at least creating even fictitious profits is mandatory. And interestingly, that the way that is done in our capitalism was a decision of courts. So even here, the state intervention is pretty apparent, and I do think having to deal with the state is one of the major problems of Marxism, because Marxists believe in a class nature state. They believe the state is effectively a function of capital. They posit a transitional state, and it is a state, a dictatorship of the proletariat, which is a temporary state of being. And I think it's interesting. I mean, Hal Draper is one of the first people who pointed out that Marxist rhetoric about this actually is a little confused, because when we talk about the dictatorship of the proletariat, we mean it in the classical Roman sense of a temporary dictatorship to move into a new status quo. But when we talk about the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, we mean it kind of like the way most people mean it, which is just like, they rule everything. And it's confusing to people. It's confusing to Marxist critics, but it's also confusing to Marxists. Why this is important when we talk about something like state capital, right? Lenin's discussion of state capital is he basically ends up kind of agreeing with Plekhanov that we're going to have to do capital development ourselves, right? We have to. There's particularly after the German Revolution fails, there's nothing to join up with, so we got to develop our own productive forces. It goes kind of the way Plekhanov says it would go. It was very, one of the things about Marxist-Leninism under Stalin is that it was kind of a move fast and break things developmental period. But I don't think that I think that we have to look at that when we talk about getting things under control. And interestingly, the book Climate Leviathan actually does see what you are saying as the most likely statistical outcome. It's not the one they want, but is what they see as the most immediately feasible, which is some kind of capitalist state leading a coalition of other capitalist states to lay down regulations in a very authoritarian manner to kind of lead to new development. And it will be ugly, according to them, the way it's going to be done, but that's probably the only likely way to do it. They also talk about climate Maoism as a way, which is a little bit more unclear, and Climate X, which is like modeling on all kinds of other, ways of dealing with land and this and the other. I kind of think we're probably, and they also talk about Climate Behemoth, which is we don't do anything and it's a war of all against all. And I've kind of thought that we're probably going to get all of that, actually. But that the state capitalism and not in a great way, probably, particularly in the West, will be how this goes, and it's going to lead to a lot of tensions when you compare it with the general trend of de-democratization that's gone on for the last 40, 50 years that people have. And by that, I don't mean just, this Bonapartist tendency to empower executive figures. I actually also mean, like, in every place on the planet, the administrative state, both economically and regulationally, has expanded significantly, particularly after the 1950s, and is not democratically accountable. And liberals actually, even though they're always going on about democracy, know it and kind of want it because they are constantly carving out or professionalizing or whatever all kinds of parts of the government so that it is not publicly accountable. And then they will often sell this to you as democracy because it is in theory responsive to the legislature, although again, not really. So I particularly think that you're right, which means that the kind of regulations and stuff we'll get here in the West will probably be shitty in a lot of ways. And it's gonna, as I pointed out, one of the ironies about neoliberalism at this point, and I tend to think that we are in something like post-neoliberalism, or we're transitioning to a new way to regulate capital, and it's very long and ugly how to get there. That I can see very strange things coming out to try to help this. And one of the things that I saw even with the progressives, and we're talking about this on the day after Cori Bush lost, but Cori Bush voted against the Infrastructure Act partly because she felt it was really important to have a carbon tax, but a carbon tax that would probably hit individual consumption, not as much large-scale economic consumption, although it might have, but I highly doubt that Democrats would do that. That would be punitive on like individuals driving their cars more than on industry.
So I think like the situation that we have now, because of the class relations that we were just talking about, the fact that the U.S. system as it existed for the past 40 years or so has basically, going on 50 years now, is to protect the capitalist class and their consumption. And things don't quite work like that in China and some of the other places like Vietnam and what have you. But the thing that I think really drives home the critique of Seder I'm making is that the fact, like, there will be like probably the regulations that you're talking about, and probably for like reasons that are totally beyond the US's control of changes in manufacturing around the world and export share. We've had our disagreements about that, but I think that for many reasons that there could be a new immiserating tendency in the U.S. and that what we'll see in many ways is very low, maybe even negative growth, and that will be less effective at combating climate change and the ecological crisis than very high growth in places like China and Vietnam that are doing huge scale investment to deal with it. And the thing with the like the state, what it's like the
well, my disagreement with you about this on China and Vietnam is I actually think even their low-hanging fruit's gone. But I do think that they're going to have a lot of competitive advantages on specifically these issues. Like I don't think that US and Europe are going to be able to keep Chinese EVs out forever.
Well, I mean, I was just looking at Chinese solar panel exports today, and the biggest importer of Chinese solar panels right now is Europe, even now.
Right.
After that, it was like Brazil and Pakistan, which, by the way, in terms of the share of like capacity Pakistan has now, they were importing like 25% of that just in the first 6 months of 2024 in solar panels. And go ahead.
No, yeah. I mean, the other problems though is everybody's having human capital issues, and by that I mean there is a decrease in population coming pretty much in all the developed world, in which I definitely include China. And that's going to have interesting effects. In the long run, you and I don't think it's necessarily bad. But the transition is going to be ugly, particularly here, because we're not. I mean, the shareholder view of growth that we've seen in the United States, and this is what makes like comparing GDP right now from like here in China a little bit distorting. You and I agree that GDP, we're not these people who say GDP doesn't tell us anything. But like GDP doesn't make a difference between productive and fictitious capital. So if like Facebook is reporting numbers that they can't valorize, but it's still going to show up in the GDP records. Like,
well, GDP is going to be income, right? Not wealth. So there's certain things,
right?
Like that the income it's not really.
But you get income from wealth valuations, though. I mean, that's the thing. That's like what these companies are often doing.
Yeah, but that's always a trade-off with someone else when you're actually pulling money out of wealth. When you're pulling money out of a stock, like so, if you do like a dividend out of a stock, you actually decrease the value of that stock a little bit, and similar things like that. But there are ways to fake GDP that aren't related to wealth.
Well, what I was going to say is I don't disagree with you. I think that a lot of these ways that we see this growing right now, like U.S. GDP growth, like these investments and shit, like very weak LLM models and machine learning that you and I have talked about, that has a lot of potential promise, but we're using it completely wrong, like, and in ways that are energy wasteful in the way we're going to do it. Right now, these cause the appearance of GDP growth, and and maybe they're real for now, but I don't think they're going to be real forever. Like, I don't think it. The way AI is currently being developed and employed, for example, the energy cost output doesn't really help. Like, go ahead.
So this is the way to think about it, right? So when you have like sectors that are from investments that aren't necessarily profitable, it is real GDP growth in that you can think of it basically as investors consuming by spending regularly. It's fake in the sense it's unsustainable, but it is like real GDP numbers because it's real economic activity.
I don't think they're just what I mean by fictitious here is technical. It just means I don't think it's valorizable because of the problems that are going to inherently become from having an unproductive product. And right now, all those LLMs are doing is efficiency gains. They're not really creating, like, you have to check them so much that you still have to use about the same amount of human labor as you would without it.
I mean, efficiency gains were in very small niches of the market, and they've really hit the limit of that, and they're not going to get much out of that. I do think so. I wanted to comment though on something. So you were talking with Huber and the guy Lee Phillips, from the Walmart book, and like there's all these problems we have today. The system obviously isn't working, but and like they're. A lot of the critiques on them is that they don't go far enough, and I think the truth of that is that like the way they're thinking about systems and what their plan is fundamentally state capitalism.
Right. Yes. Agreed.
And it's like when they say, "Oh yeah, well, even nationalizing everything would be such a big boon, like such a big change and stuff." Which yes, it would be, but where does that get you? That leaves you at the NEP, right? It doesn't even get you to like the high communism stage of what the Soviet Union was,
right. And there'd be no reason to go to that form of high communism either, barring a war. I mean, like the incentives wouldn't be there because we've already done a lot of that development. So go ahead.
So and this brings me back to like where I ended the letter to Cosmonaut is that like the state capitalism is probably necessary to get us out of this crisis. It's probably and is a lot more effective than whatever the hell most of the West is doing right now. But it's like not there is a truth to the critique by a lot of degrowthers that because you're not controlling the consumption, you're not actually creating a permanently sustainable situation to the extent humans can. And I think that is what characterizes a situation of like higher communism and socialism, is this ability to rationalize household consumption in some way. That even in like Cockshot's kind of model, I mean, there's like people can put in demand in the market, but there's ways to, because money doesn't exist anymore, you can, and there's still central planners, you can very effectively cut into that. You can deliberately choose what technology or production techniques you want and which ones you don't in a conscious way. And that's one of the big things that's missing from them, I think.
Well, when we talk about household consumption, like you and I agree that consumption does have to change. There's a lot of unnecessary consumption, and a lot of what people, the anti-consumers will focus on is actually not the important stuff. Like you having, my favorite stupid collection books in your house isn't really a major contributor to the problems of society, but energy uses is, and energy efficiency could be changed by changing what's on, a consumption market. I mean, you and I are assuming something probably like labor tokens, not currency, but we aren't assuming total rationing either. And that's one of the things that's different from some forms of degrowth. And again, when I hear people talk about degrowth, it's all over the place what they actually think the answer is. Sato's was actually or Saito or whatever was actually much more moderate than I thought it was going to be. It was kind of underwhelming, actually, and I don't think it would work. So you do have to develop a ton of capacity. I think what people rightly would say, though, but isn't Marxism about freedom? And you and I would say, yeah, but we're not arguing about, when we talk about rationalization, we are not talking about like total control of everything in the household. But it would be like there are very inefficient houses right now. Like
So there's a couple of things. Right. So going back to, I remember what it was called. It's Jevons paradox, when the efficiency of increases in efficiency don't lead to decreases in throughput because people just use it more because it's cheaper. And that problem goes away in any kind of planned economy with socialism, because investment is a social thing that is socially controlled. So right now we have there is no social control over investment at all. Well, I mean, marginal cases, but that's one thing that's out of our control right now. I think that one thing that like an easy way to rationalize household consumption in a socialist society is to say, well, we see that market clearing prices would still be a thing in that kind of society, but investment is still something socially determined. So if you think that if increasing production of this using the certain production technique is not a socially good thing, you can control that, and that isn't something that can go out whichever way people want. But at the same time, so I like the idea of of a different corporate structure of voluntary associations that now we just have households basically, but in towards new socialism they also talk about we'll have communes as well, and I'm sure that there's all kinds of ways that you could rationalize consumption in a commune that would make it more efficient and all kinds of things like that, and this would just be a different corporate form of voluntary association.
Yeah, well, you and I have talked about this a little bit. I mean, I actually believe in all kinds of nested. One of the problems that I have is I think centralized efficiency is good, but to remind people, there's a reason why we have two lungs. But because biologically cascade failure is disastrous. But things like nested communes, nested Soviet structures, levels of planning, those, particularly with modern communication facilitation, are kind of easy to do. And while I'm not delusional and think we're going to ever get rid of all status consumption, if you're coming to those things in a communal way, the social pressures within that commune are going to limit status consumptions. And that's one of the, that's a big individual waster. And then other things like, when we think about social planning and we okay, we're going to have to deal with a lot of old houses, modernize them in some way. We would have to deal with apartment blocks. We have to better use land. I mean, one of the good ideas I got from Bordiga way back then is we really do have to deal with the town and country problem. And urbanization, the urbanization technologies are good, but not in the way they're currently used. They're currently used that way specifically for capital. If we don't have capital concerns like that, and we can diffuse out production in a lot of ways from a centralized plan, you can do stuff like, multi-person apartment blocks with free access land all around it. And I've even seen that in capitalist societies. And these are things that communes would be incentivized to do. On capitalism, there's no incentive to do them. So
there's two things there. One is that one with what you were talking about before about having redundancy and that we don't want things to be too centralized. I wrote a blog recently just because I was thinking about how we should think about enterprises in a socialist system, and entrepreneurship and competition and those kinds of things. Because in Cockshot's model in Towards New Socialism, he just kind of says that people get assigned wherever the planner tells them to. There is no actual enterprises as independent things in that kind of socialist society. But I think that's a really not a good idea for the problems with centralism you were just talking about. I propose to say, based off of what I know about government contracting, since I've worked in that, I've worked in small government contractors since I left college, and what they do, or what the idea was, is that even though enterprises shouldn't own their own capital in order so that can all be socially organized, we should still think about how of enterprises as institutions, and that there's like institutional knowledge and capabilities that you lose if you're just randomly putting people together, and having basically managers being able to prove themselves by bidding on contracts with people that they're voluntarily associating with and building institutions out of that basically come into being so long as they have contracts, and basically disappear when they don't have contracts. I thought that would be a pretty clever way of dealing with that. Other thing I wanted to say was about the communal investment. And this relates to the other 2 points I was making in my letter, which is that that the economic stuff and the capitalist consumption aren't necessarily related to the economic throughput is not realistic, and that capitalist consumption aren't necessarily related to growth, because when we get rid of capitalist consumption, and some of it still has to, assuming that capitalism, the physical people are still around, they still need to have some income to reproduce themselves, even if it's not whatever they were getting before. But just as importantly, now that we've freed up that income, is the responsible thing to do just to idle that economic capacity? Or is it better, if there's this enormous task in front of us of preventing ecological catastrophe, should we be organizing labor and making investments in infrastructure to try to avoid that somehow? And it seems obvious to me that you would need to do those things, and those things are economic activity. They potentially create growth. And particularly with thinking about like a commune, is that they will have to be making investments in the community or whatever. This is probably this is something I've thought about from I've learning about it from the Chinese collective period, the principle of self-taxation, which I think is probably going to be very important going forward because of various reasons. But you need to have some that organization of the part of that rationalization of household consumption is also making getting people together to work to make the infrastructure that requires less material throughput. And that it's not just investment, it also means maintenance, because investments depreciate over time, they physically wear down. And that maintenance is also economic activity. It's a whole cost category of GDP right now. And that's also something you have to think about.
So this brings us to some of the others. I mean, I do think we have to talk about the state a little bit more. And I agree with you that basically what the People's Republic and what we say fairly democratic centralized fairly democratic planning, those kind of things, a lot of their models are still by and large effectively state capitalist, more responsible, co-op driven, et cetera, but they are still about generating surplus, and they allow for the accumulation of wealth. And I know this is a basic point, but when I talk about eventually Marx played with labor tokens, Cockshot uses labor tokens plus cybernetic theory. But labor tokens does repeat some of the things of markets, in that there's choices of what you get with your labor time, effectively, right? From the collective pool, you can get things that you want with a labor token. What you can't do is use it as a store of value beyond that, and use it and leverage it over time, and you can't transfer it in a way to leverage additional goods in most labor token schemes. So people can know what we're talking about. Mm-hmm.
But what I'm talking about isn't necessarily just even the token or exchange part, although they used like a point system on the communes in China.
Yeah, they did.
I'm almost thinking of self-taxation in terms of corvée labor, which is just commanding labor to do something for you, and because the point system, because they weren't exchanged for something, they weren't related to the external exchange of the commune. You could make infrastructure investments by getting a bunch of people to dig a ditch, and that wasn't really related. That's not really the same thing of the problems of it not quite being communism or whatever. But I do think that there is like what you're talking about with Sato and what he's proposing, like the communal thinking, or like the local thing. So I have not read his solutions exactly, but it sounds like to me that the closest thing that exists to what he's talking about is probably Rojava in Syria,
right? Yeah,
and which also has like a strong ecological ideology through Bookchin. That got picked up by the Kurds there in the PKK. But
yeah, weird Marxist-Leninist Bookchinism. But
yeah, it's really funny in retrospect that happened. But at the same time, it is so typical of I think the problems with degrowth ideology, because they are. They don't care about growth per se, but they are reliant on oil production in the areas they control. It's one of the main things the only economic activities that they have to export, and which is actually like there's actually been some battles today between the Syrian forces and the Kurds there, but I think it's still typical of what the kind of problems you'd run into in trying to implement a degrowth situation, because when you're not trying to make big investments that would probably cause growth, when you're focused on just decreasing economic activity, you're leaving in place the very inefficient and like the things that are left are those inefficient and sometimes fossil fuel producing activities. Like there was a study that got cited in that original Eco-Leninism article, saying like, oh, we could live on like 5% of the energy that we do now, so it shouldn't be a problem. That we don't even need to make investments, like really big investments. And I looked at that study, and it said we are assuming that everything gets switched to state-of-the-art technology that is the most efficient.
Well, how do you do that if you're not using a lot of energy to produce the state-of-the-art technology that's the most efficient?
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't work. You need to you need to have a bunch of investment and economic activity to get to that situation.
And this is a problem with the chaos of the market in a lot of ways, because like right now, for example, let's just talk about EV technology. EV technology versus driving an old car, right? Old car has a lot of environmental damage to it, but the new EV, if you're treating them in all the time, does more damage, right? But under socialism, there's no incentive for us to do that. Like there would be an incentive, like, yeah, sure, there might be personal electric vehicles for you can borrow for some things, but like, and I'm not against them being nice and cool or whatever under socialist society. I'm not, a hair shirt socialist. But I do sort of think like, yeah, but the most efficient way would just be having better electric public transit. I don't like, I don't really know, except in low population areas. And when we talk about the long durée of socialism, we are talking about, balancing out populations on the planet and stuff. Like people, I don't think pick up how big some of the stuff we're talking about is to enable the kind of freedom that we want to enable. I mean, like,
so I mean, like right now, it's definitely better to have an electric car than just be driving around a gas car all the time. Even though it's not like there's still gas emissions and material associated with the electric car. It's not like it's still quite a bit better because of just how much you're using with the car. But it's at the same time, it's not like an ideal solution because it's not like it's compared to having like several thousand cars to having a good public transportation system. It's clear that the transportation system just uses less stuff overall. It's more rational.
It's rationalized. It makes population movements easier. I mean, like, and again, I'm not saying there wouldn't be any personal vehicles, but, and yes, I do think ultimately if you can switch to an EV or a hybrid, you should switch an EV to a hybrid. But I also do think that if you are trading in a car, prematurely to get an EV, you are actually still causing ecological damage. There's studies on this that back that up. So, and if you trade those EVs in regularly, you are, contributing to the cost. And unfortunately, consumer habits aren't great. Now, some of that's being fixed today, unfortunately, by the market, but in shitty ways. I mean, one of the ways it's being fixed today is people can't afford new cars. So they're not buying them the way they used to. And when they do buy them, they tend to try to offset their cost of the high-priced new cars by buying a hybrid or an EV, usually a hybrid. I mean, one of the things about EVs that are also suboptimal in the current conditions is you need to own a house in most places in the United States for them to be easily powerable, unless you're lucky in a major city and have access to things pretty consistently. It's just not easy for renters who aren't renters and single house units unless they put them in to charge EVs, and that has not yet happened. So there's all kinds of infrastructure problems because we're letting the market fix it. But we didn't build the infrastructure that we have even for the capitalist society by market forces. The market forces didn't set up the U.S. highway system, even though they're dependent on it. And that's something that we have to deal with even under capital, that like expecting the market to do all that is nutty. But as I talked to Huber, one of the points I think he made that's solid is you're right. We're going to have to do a lot of upfront investment, and it's going to lead to a lot of economic activity in the near run to be able to do the kind of reductions that people want. We can't just assume that like having, I talk about this in terms of water usage. Like one of the problems in a city like Atlanta is the cost of fixing the water system, even though they're running out of water. What's the cost? Well, you have old ass pipes that are not particularly efficient, and we would have to spend the energy to dig them up and use the resources to dig them up. And that's a massive expenditure. It's easier to do it if you're doing like big projects and doing them all at once and trying to piecemeal that. And so there's no way for that economic activity not to be disruptive, but it would be something we could do, plan out, and mitigate that under current market conditions, we really can't. And how do we plan on the market conditions? Bourgeois state imposed regulations, which are not so much, they're just stopping you from doing the worst things. They're not necessarily helping you do the best things. I mean, you could subsidize stuff. That's the other thing we do, but that's about it.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, and right now we kind of need to do the opposite of subsidize things because the whole fossil fuel infrastructure needs to be rapidly depreciated. And that's not something that has ever been, that's not a policy tool that the U.S. state has ever had. It's funny because this whole thing of like depreciation investment is a big part of that's kind of ignored a lot of times. Like when you talk about like the car being turned over, I never really thought about like, oh, how many people are buying a bunch of electric cars every year or something? Because I bought my first electric car this year, and before that I've been driving a 2007 truck that I expect I'll have this electric car for another at least 10 years or something. And it's strange to me to think that people will be buying cars regularly. But I guess that's another thing that you have to think about in a social society is what should be the proper depreciation, turnover rates, maintenance rates for things.
Right. I mean, yeah. As I talked about, go ahead.
It should like be rationalized to a certain extent that we should be able to. I think in a perfect world, we should be able to make all of the like durable goods for a society one at a time. Like 1 year, we're just making tables, and the next year we're making refrigerators or something like that, because we know exactly how much the society should need over that period or something.
Well, it's one of the things I think about a lot of the time, even in early capitalism, before it had really taken off in industrial production, was that stuff was made to last a long time. Today, for a variety of reasons, one of which is a kind of backdoor form of inflation where you make the same shit, but you make it with cheaper materials. And not necessarily more durable materials. And then, sometimes cheaper materials are good. Maybe they're better, but not in most cases today. MDF is not better than wood. And I think about that because in a socialist society, why the hell would we make anything that would be made not to last? Go ahead.
This is one of the real problems with GDP, is that there's no good way of knowing what the depreciation rate is for common household goods.
Yes, yeah.
And those things there's probably been like growth in terms of real, in terms of the things that people, it's probably way lower than the official stats say, because the value of a desk that lasts 40 years is way higher, like the real value, than a desk that lasts 5 years. But that's not something that somebody figuring out CPI is going to know or could know. And that's just not reflected in the real GDP numbers.
Absolutely. Okay, so this brings us to go ahead.
I mentioned that in the letter, actually, specifically, is that if we really got into doing this, like making things really durable, that would actually increase real GDP by rapid deflation, because things would be worth a lot more if it was actually accounted for correctly.
Right, and we don't, because we only calculate for nominal values.
We try real values, but we're not good at it.
Yeah, we're terrible at it. At least with household goods. Like, you can kind of do it for fixed capital and production, but there's better ways to do it. You can do it for houses, yeah, but like my desk being shit versus a desk I inherited that was built in the 30s, and had until I don't know when I lost it, but those things are very different things. They're just completely different sets of but the function that they have, and economically they're pretty much identical. Like, no one's going to say like, oh, this old desk is more valuable than the new desk, even if it's providing use for way longer, and thus I don't have to replace it. And this is something we talk about. I mean, this is known a lot in like junk, like I always hold up the iPhone for a lot of these things I've held up for you before, but I bring this up because the iPhone's actually a fairly good product. A lot of these smartphones are good products, and they brick themselves deliberately so that people will buy them, because the camera is better between an iPhone 15 and an iPhone 7, but there's not a lot of marked innovation. And in fact, one of the weird things about contemporary capitalism in the West is we're not big on doing hardware and physical commodities at all anymore, even if we produce a lot of them. I mean, but like that's not sexy capital right now. I guess the exception to that would be like NVIDIA chips.
Most of those aren't made in the U.S. either.
Yeah. Shh. We're not going to talk about how Vietnam's taking advantage of U.S. Decoupling with China. There is a point, though, that we haven't got to this in your letter that I think is actually really important. And this is the same, this is my problem with a bunch of leftist thinkers. And from David Graeber to all kinds of, even certain Marxist-Leninists, who perceive of the problems of relations of production as just a matter of thoughts. And not that there are material incentives that statistically make certain relations more likely, and material incentives that make other relations less likely. And weirdly, David Graeber, of all people, is one of the people who both notices and then deliberately ignores this. Like, he talks about, mountain peoples, tend to not be very controllable by the state. And I'm like, well, duh, they're in a fucking mountain. It's really hard to control them. It seems like the physical structures and the environment literally are part of why that is happening. Similarly, he was talking about that with coastal people. They can just bug off to the water for a while. And I'm like, yeah, they can, because they're near water. That's not, I guess the political will there is being near water, but that I can't replicate that everywhere, right? So I wanted to ask you, what kinds of things do you think a lot of these eco-socialists, both bright green and degrowth, miss about incentive structures and transformations of relation and production?
Yeah. So, in the example in the article I was responding to, is saying Stalin, because he didn't focus on the relations of production, didn't fix this problem. I'm sure, but even in very radical situations of, I genuinely think in collective period China, they tried to change the relations of production.
No, I do too. I've actually said that, ironically, 65 to 78 China, it didn't have I will agree actually with the Chinese themselves. They didn't have the material forces to do it right yet, but they really are the only people who truly have tried to do labor tokens, to do local collective decision making, to rebalance out skills. One of the things people miss about the rustification of the intellectuals wasn't that it was always about punishing the intellectuals. It was also about putting them out in the countryside to skill people who do not have access to city levels of accumulated knowledge. And it's really not, there's no way to do that without redividing the population. Go ahead.
It's, there's so many things that happen in that moment, the bringing people in, to the countryside, the academics and stuff, higher level education basically broke down in China during that period, but the primary level education only
was excellent.
Yeah, it was the fact that it exists at all in rural China is because of that period, and
it was slightly undone during the early Deng period too.
But if you look at other countries, if you look at India, all totally not educated rural areas compared to China. A lot of other countries in the area.
There's also increased social trust because of that period, and I do worry a little bit in China when they lose anyone with any memory of the collective period about that social trust, because Michael Sandel has written about this, about young people in China not having the same social trust and actually kind of believing Western meritocratic. No, he was writing about that 10 years ago. I'm not sure that it's still true, but I do think the collective period really did put people in proximity to each other who had never been in proximity to each other before.
It is. I have some lines in an unpublished article right now. They'll hopefully come out eventually, about how China is weirdly prescient in history of preceding social forms, because bureaucracy was invented in China, and and then it took off in Europe like 1,000 years later. But
probably through the Sicilians taking it to the Normans, but from the Islamic world. But yes, agreed. Like,
yeah, I mean, some people think it wasn't related, but it definitely seems related to me that they took it directly. I don't have good sources for that, but what happened there in the collective period, those ideas of self-taxation and the ideas of the end, like of a non-professional state, like modern state, those things I feel will come back eventually at one point or another, because that is like it solves so many problems with the proper material base for it to make it actually work. If you had that, I think it would be much more efficient and effective than the administrative apparatuses that we've developed now.
Yeah, I actually, I mean, I've talked about the paradox of China in that period, because in one hand, it was actually really, really, truly doing socialism immediately seriously. And on the other hand, what it was doing internationally was a disaster for the socialist movement. I hesitate to categorize someone's foreign policy as mean girl bullshit, but like some of what they were doing in, say, Africa, or siding with the United States, just to spite the Soviet Union, like, are like when, being nice to Pinochet, like, and that was just to spite this. It's like, that's kind of, that's disastrously petty. It did enable them to set up good relations with the West to get the overhead capital they needed that they couldn't get otherwise eventually. But that was actually more dung than Mao. I think people should study the collective period more, and I don't think they should study it the way that it gets like lionized in the New Left or in Mao Spandex or any of that. Not that all that's bad, but I mean, I really go in and look at what they were doing, because when people are like, oh, the Cultural Revolution was so awful, and I'm like, yeah, but then how was life expectancy increasing pretty dramatically during that time in particular? Like, it's hard for me to square that with every, like, it was a bloody mess. I do think there were bloody messes it happening that were unnecessary, absolutely, but I don't think that actually defines most of what was going on. And I think the other problem that you had, and this was a problem Mao realized, but that he was setting up a system that was going to come flat into party bureaucracy, but he both wanted to control but needed that party bureaucracy. That's something, however, that we can deal with more now with communication technologies. We can systematize things that we probably had to bureaucratize. Not that I'm going to think we're going to be without any bureaucracy. Like, I know that there's going to be bureaucracy, although I would hope that it is not, that's another thing that's collectivized. It's basically like the bureaucrats are sortitioned and we've systematized their knowledge, and like you go train to be a bureaucrat for a while, you serve for 5 years and you get out, like, or something, like, I do think we have to think about that, but
yeah, it's a very important that it be deprofessionalized.
Right.
But it's so funny because this isn't just a left thing, actually, of ignorance about the collective period. Is even people who specialize, like the whole field of comparative economics and thinking about what institutions, economics, like when I took a class by a guy who even taught it back in the Cold War about comparative economics, we learned all about the Soviet system and material balancing and everything. And then he said, "Oh, China is just the Soviet Union, but worse. They just more incompetent." And it's like
absolutely
there's so much more that was going on there, though. There's so many huge experiments that happened that will probably be world historically consequential in retrospect. Well, to relate this back to what you were asking about the relations of production and thinking that's just a matter of will, it's so obviously not, because even when you try, even when you have the will, there are Like having the material capabilities to do things matters the most. Because if either you can do it or you can't. And this is a problem both for the degrowthers and for I think some of the like
bright greeners too.
The what?
The bright greeners.
Yeah, and also the Lee Phillips people, even because they're
Go ahead.
They're like there's either you think for these people either they think, oh, we can just make this happen, or they all think that we can just use the technology and things that we have now in various ways, like either by just not using them or by using them more, basically. But really, planning and doing things like being able to control consumption bundles in a rational way, that will require whole new social technologies and systems. A whole new kind of knowledge.
Yeah, this is one thing I've tried to talk to people about a little bit. Yes, in a new social system, you approximate both physical and social technologies of the old. Marx talks about usury and banking and feudalism versus what it does in capitalism, right? And the difference of relations there. And he also talks about like how the rentier becomes a capitalist by bundling rents into commodities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, that's like a big thing for him. And I think we will see similar things, but there are things that I do think like, no, you can't just turn Walmart's logistics system into a co-op because there are teleological hangups in it based on capitalist production models that you're going to have to redo. Like,
I mean, yes, you could do it, but it wouldn't like be a magic bullet to anything. It would just be Walmart,
right?
Some pre-distributed profits.
Well, I mean, this is why what you say is like state capitalism is the teleologies of these technologies, both social and material, pretty much are assumed to just be democratized. And
yeah.
and I'm like, well, once you democratize it truly, things start changing in a big way. And it would require us to rethink a lot of this stuff through. And there's also times where I'm like, hey, you want to do this massive industrial development project. How are you going to train the people for it now? Like, and with what people? Like, whenever we talk about reshoring in America, and I'm like, yeah, you know, the automation technologies are way more efficient. Phil Neal's really good on this. And that has all kinds of implications. If we try to do Fordism the way we did in the 50s with today's technology, it wouldn't work because, frankly, the automated technology is too efficient for it. But to think about this in a broader way, these social technologies are things that we build on, but we don't just democratize them in and of themselves. Like we do have to change how they're being used in some fundamental ways. And I do think the collective period in China is sort of like a proof that you can do that on some kind of mass scale. They fucked up in a lot of ways. I mean, some of the stuff with agricultural productivity in particular was a problem. But they have those social technologies, and my fear about socialists right now, as we talk about like the eco stuff, is I do sometimes think that they kind of think we just need one major planner, like the big guy in the sky model, which is when people complain about like say Stalinism, and everyone's unhappy with me when I talk about Stalin because I'm not a Stalin fan, but I'm also not the person who like quakes in my boots that I think that Stalin was super Hitler. But part of the problems with Stalinism, as Cockshot points out, but also kind of weirdly defends, is that Stalin really did, let out democratic social forces in an uncontrolled way. And that's really what the purges ended up. That's why they ended up being so bad. That's why the Yishavshchina ended up being so bad. Is you unmask social forces, and part of the reason for that, I really do believe from the work of J. Alpha Geddes, is that the having to industrialize that fast had such social consequences. And I'm going to give China credit. They didn't do that.
Yeah.
In any of their phases. They didn't do that. You know, some of the late Deng early Xi Jinping period stuff was brutal, but it wasn't like the 30s in China. And you might go, oh, well, the Cultural Revolution was like that. I'm like, the Cultural Revolution, its death toll was nothing like the Years of China. Now we could talk about other death tolls in China and like the Great Leap Forward. I do tend to think some of the Chinese apologists in the Great Leap Forward are underplaying how many people died as opposed to the capitalists who are overplaying how many people died. But
well, there is like an interesting thing that like there was a grain of truth to what my teacher was talking about, in the sense that like the big starvations in China didn't happen because they destroyed this like quasi petty bourgeois peasant. Like they basically went to war with their peasantry. Like that didn't happen in China. What happened was it was actually incompetence and fundamental flaws of the way they had their system, which is they just did not have information and bureaucratic control over the agricultural sector,
right,
and asked to do contradictory things. And whereas in the USSR, they really went to war with the peasantry. Stalin called World War II like, oh yeah, this is just like my war with the peasantry. And the thing, but this is another thing I was thinking about when I was writing my blog about socialist entrepreneurship and competition, is that like in the USSR, that was all like they're partly because of the way their enterprises worked, and like you had like the bureaucracy, and you had enterprises that were just the bureaucracy, and those kind of kulaks were deliberately suppressed because they had these values that were totally opposed to what was going on, and interests opposed to it. And then you had in China the cultivation of entrepreneurs in like in their new state capitalist development period. But you really have to think about like a way to have socialist entrepreneurship, because like you need dynamic institutions. And if you look at all the enterprises in the USSR and how they stagnated and how became totally useless and not capable of innovating, like the lack of competition and the lack of entrepreneurship are basically two sides of the same coin there. And I think it is so necessary to be able to articulate a way that those forces can be used for good in a social society. Because otherwise, this whole problem that we have right now with a militant reactionary petty bourgeoisie are essentially unsolvable. They are problems that like lead directly back into the problems of Soviet collectivization, essentially, except in a more like politicized dimensions. And so that's one reason I wrote that. It's a bit of a tangent to the like degrowth situation.
I see. I think that's actually kind of important to think about, though, when we think about like how we deal with incentives and structures, and how we deal with like even environmental structures beyond just obvious things like climate change. I mean, there's a lot to do with the environment that you have to deal with, and there's a lot that you're going to have to deal with, particularly when you're trying to end uneven development with the developing world. And
well,
because one thing, go ahead.
Well, you're definitely right, because it's the thing with the resistance to any kind of socialist ecological socialism right now. It's, if you look at the reaction to it, it is not just a purely material interest thing. It is a deeply psychological kind of and also like values thing with the like reactionary forces in society, that they really want that they associate fossil fuels with some kind of independence and ability to create and control and be like great in like a Nietzschean sense or whatever. And that is a big problem that we'll have to confront, not just as there's a sense that like there's an explicit reactionary enunciation of that, but there's also like a kind of folk ideology version of that is kind of dispersed everywhere, especially in the developing world, especially in America, that you need to find a way around. I think that there was that the idea, the rhetorical ways that people talk about, like with the Green New Deal and stuff, I think just mostly failed because partly because of things that we've talked about before, that it is still so focused on the bourgeois state and creating like a dependence on it, more or less. And I think that that crisis of imagination is really dangerous in this situation.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I mean, I think we're gonna have to like think through a lot of this in very big ways, and I also think we have to be both more ambitious and less ambitious simultaneously. I do think sometimes we need everything now. That's not going to happen. But I also think like one of the things that you talk about innovation, I've thought a lot about this in another context. Like the Soviet Union controlled its bureaucracy during the period of both high Stalinism, quote unquote, or high communism and war communism, basically through violence. And that's socially exhausting. Nobody can maintain that forever. And also it's a bad fucking idea. Like in general, I'm not a person who's a pacifist. I don't think we're going to get any of this without some violence, but like you do not want to maximize violence and have that be your primary way to induce innovation and or control your apparatchiks, etc. So the question comes to how we're going to think about this. Like, and I did think like your stuff about, returning something like socialist entrepreneurship. I don't like the term, but this idea of like social competition and social antagonism, but for good productive ends, is going to be important. It's going to be important for innovation. It's going to be important for, it's even important for, controlling the bureaucrats, keeping them from reprofessionalizing, because that's one thing you don't want, keeping professional political caste from developing. Like one thing we do know from relatively egalitarian social hunter-gatherer societies is they're hostile to each other if they need to be. Like it's not all kumbaya around the campfire. There's some of that, there's a lot of that, but there's also like no, I'm going to mock the people who are trying to break the rules, and if they don't take the mocking, then eventually it's going to get slightly violent. I think we have to think about that when we build these systems, particularly when we think the stake of like not just human survival, but like most life, maybe not all of it, but most life on the planet could be really fucked by our current decisions.
Yeah.
And I'm not one of these people who's just like, I realize species go extinct and shit, but mass extinctions are bad. Like, yeah. You don't.
Life is good,
right? Exactly. And I do think that's something we have to think about as we go forward. And I think That's going to mean incorporating all kinds of different ways that humans have thought and all different kinds of times into what we're doing now. And that can't, and I agree with you, that can't be done just by saying, hey, we should do it because we think it would be a good idea. Or X didn't address it, it's a failure in their ideology. It may be a failure in their ideology, but as I've said to some of the things, my problem with a lot of Marxist-Leninism about Stalin, it's not that they're often wrong that there was a whole lot of choices in some of these situations. Some of the errors are unforced, but not all of them, right? My problem isn't that we acknowledge that. My problem is that we didn't try to like make that a good and just try to repeat it over and over again. Because I'm like, why would we do that? Like, we can learn from that cul-de-sac if we can get over, the fact that we're always trying to defend ourselves against capitalist lying or misunderstanding or decontextualizing. If we can get beyond that and actually look at like, okay, why did this happen? Why did so many people die in the Great Leap Forward? Like, even assuming lower numbers, I remember I was talking to I forget his name right now. The Chinese scholar who wrote a defense of the Cultural Revolution, but he also had a defense of the Great Leap Forward in it. And some of the stuff was like, well, just people were dying a little younger, and I'm like, I mean, that happens when you fuck up. Well,
it's so funny. It's writing that, and then COVID happens, and China has its lockdowns in response to it. That also old people don't die a little younger,
right? I mean, and they were really. I mean, I think we sometimes give China a little bit too much credit for its early handling of the COVID pandemic, but by 3 months in, they did way better than a whole lot of other people, like most of the West. And I think, even assuming that maybe there was some misinformation and misreporting, even from the Chinese government itself, I'm still assuming that we would notice if, like, I don't know, 50 million old people died in China.
I mean,
it'd be hard to hide.
Bury them. There's evidence. So, like, I remember having a conversation with someone who was like a big skeptic, and like, like it's not really happening like in India or whatever. I was like, we have like satellite photos of the cemeteries and stuff, right? That we can see the people who are dying. It's not just satellites, but but it's related to that thing of being able to learn from past mistakes. I certainly feel that from the reaction from my more recent article on materialism, that the intellectual culture on the left has not progressed far in the past 100 years.
We really like our 19th century. We really do. Really like the Marxist left in particular. We have arguments about physics based off of Aristotelian assumptions. Like it's sometimes real fun.
Yeah, I mean that's half of what Sato's doing too, in doing Marxology for all of these arguments and stuff, right?
I will say, I increasingly, the first book is not so bad, but the other books, I increasingly think some of his Marxology is dishonest, and he just goes, "Well, you didn't see the stuff in the MAGA archives," and I'm like, "Okay, yeah, but what you actually publish is like the Sassuwitz letters and all the normal shit that I know that people use to, like, they're your get out of jail free cards for Marx, like." So if there's something really, other than some more stuff about Liebig, really illuminating in there, please share it. Because what your current arguments don't, outside of the first book, don't really base off that. And I don't know why we need to make a Marxological argument, about even before you and I are going to do an episode on the paradoxes of Bordiga because I'm writing on them. I will say Bordiga's reading on Marxist ecology in the 50s is way ahead of everybody else. Like, I don't agree with all of it, and some people take it into weird directions, like they use it to go into rerouting. But if you read like Humans on the Crust of the Earth, he picks up on things that Paul Burkett picked up on, you know, way later. But that aside, what I found it funny because there's a section in Humans on the Crust of the Earth that he talks about Liebig and Marx's use of Liebig. So I was even like, oh, even that's not new. Apparently, we've known about that since the 50s. Like, as Bordiga's referencing it, it couldn't have been that hard to find because he didn't have access to the Marx Engels archives. So it's something to think about.
I think people really love Marxology because it gives them a entitlement of authority, basically, without having to do all the other scientific materialist work of actually learning a bunch of different topics that are often disjointed. There's no guidebook of how to look at all these things. Whereas, like, you want to know Marxism, just here's the big list, you know, this is how you do it. And whereas, like, actually developing coherent thoughts about what's actually going on in the world, there is no guidebook for that.
Right.
You have to think for yourself.
Well, it's like when people tell me the development of capitalism and they quote to me Das Kapital, and I love Das Kapital, don't get me wrong, but I'm like, that's not a material accounting of all of capitalism and its history. It's not. And it doesn't even pretend to be. Yes, he's got real history in there about the enclosures and all that stuff. Yes, he's doing real empirical research, but he's also taking the arguments of Adam Smith at face value and working them out. And I'm going to say, like, Smith was trying to do science for this day. I don't think he was making shit up. I don't think he was trying to mislead people. His knowledge limitations are what they are. And I've always taken the Stephen Gould talk about when he compares Marxism to evolutionary theory. And it's like, well, we'll know when Marxism actually starts to progress again, because we won't be worried about Marxology because we don't worry about Darwinology. No one's telling you, hey, go back and read The Origin of Species. We don't have Origin of Species reading groups. Maybe we should sometime. I mean, to be quite frank. And as a person who, on the Marxology stuff, I often think a lot of the Marxology is still bad hermeneutics, because it's like, okay, so you're favoring the interpretation of some like footnote over published texts that were signed off by the author. Like, if someone took all my notes and tried to make them into coherent like philosophy, holy shit.
Yeah, like, it'd be insane. I think it's just, there's a deep desire there, I think, for the esoteric. That is, everybody wants access to secret knowledge, when I think that usually the best knowledge is the exoteric, that you can like go back to. It's like, yeah, this is what that means. And you can actually interpret it properly. Because like going back to the beginning of our discussion, and like the thing with like the personification, reification, bearers of commodities, all that stuff, real subsumption, even all those things. Oh my god,
real subsumption is a oh god.
But it's like all that stuff is used to justify this. It is a deep theory reading of Marx that everyone comes up to, basically, and it's also scientifically, in the scientific sense that Marx meant, because they never mention the empirical side of that. They never talk about specifically how it's connected to what Marx is saying with the means of production and how that's supposed to develop. Because if they did, it'd be obviously wrong.
Yeah, I was about to say, particularly with something like real subsumption or total reification, like, it is like if you grasp basic reification, it's really important. Like, you understand like how money works, of any variety. But there are ways where, like, I'm like, you're trying to explain the totality of social interactions by a theoretical construct, and reification was a big one in the early 20th century. I feel like real subsumption, which is another thing that's like barely spoken about in published marks and is only a few fragments in unpublished marks. It gets used to make all kind of, from Negri forward, to make all kinds of weird claims about what is and is not possible. So much so that I often don't know what people even mean by it. And I've read the real subsumption text. Like, I'm always like, okay, what do you mean? Like I got in an argument about slavery and capitalism, and blah blah blah. Real subsumption means that slavery is not semi-capitalist. I'm like, look, okay, I get that. Like our typologies, capitalism. It's not a word Marx even uses that much. He usually uses bourgeois society for that shit. But even setting that aside, it's a prior social form being reappropriated in a new social form. And yes, eventually it would be fully reappropriated, I guess. The problem is, with slavery in particular, is that it treats humans as fixed capital. And in doing so, renders getting productivity gains from them without direct cost a lot harder to do. AKA kind of impossible. Like, people have noted like how much like physical physical intimidation and overseeing overcosts and stuff that you need to do that. And when we talk about like the wealth of, say, the planter class and why they were so wealthy, well, that's because the slaves counted as assets and that was part of the valuation. So it's something that I think about when people talk about that. It doesn't really, if you want to call it fully capitalist, that's fine. I don't actually really care when I say like semi-feudal versus capitalist, whatever. Although it misses the reason why I worry about it is it misses, what is going on in free labor. And free labor there is in somewhat quotation marks, but it is not compelled in the way slavery is. It's not corvée labor. It is not serf labor. It is not slave. It is not chattel slavery. There's a double-edged sword when you talk about wage slavery. Marx clearly doesn't think wage slavery is the same as slavery. Some people seem to try to make him be claiming that, but he does sometimes rhetorically not look at the difference that he himself is spelling out, because once you treat human beings as fixed capital, you will do horrible things to them. Anyway, that's a long digression. But my point is, like, Marxology is kind of important if you're talking about what Marx thought, and I'm into Marxology, but it doesn't, I agree with you, it doesn't settle any of the questions. Like, I'm not going to base how we organize our society around ecology based off of Marx's footnote on Liebig. Like, I can base that off of empirical evidence. Like,
I think it's useful sometimes to look at, well, what's the actual context of what he was writing in, of like what, because a lot of times he's responding to like not even Ricardo, but Ricardo's critics.
Right.
And nobody remembers who those were, just on their own.
Or like William Petty, or like, because I've had to recently, in conversations with Colin Drummond in general, I had to go back and read some of that and be like, okay, what was actually being talked about here? But also recently, and I'm going to use this because it came up on fucking Twitter, somebody was using Engels' writing about the communes in America in 1844 as proof that Marx thought communism has already been achieved and realized in America, and that you don't achieve communism. And I'm like, A, that's Engels. B, that's like a year after Marx and Engels started working together. C, those communes failed, and he's clearly talking about the Owenites and the 48ites, and he's talking about the fact that the material conditions do exist right now, with a little bit more development, but he's not saying that the communes are communism as a social totality. Those guys just like ignore it. but that's a Marxology reading. It's a weird one. It's a completely decontextualized one, but it is textually there, particularly if you're not reading it in German and you're not reading very closely.
It was so funny. One of the reactions to my materialism essay was the one that had the most likes and attention on Twitter was someone basically demanding a citation for why I said materialism was the crown jewel of Marx's philosophy.
What? That got a bunch of likes that you needed a citation for that?
Yeah, they kept. I asked them, like, "What do you mean?" And they kept saying, "Give me a citation."
That's like when people ask me all the time when I'm like doing analysis and synthesizing things, and people are like, "Well, what book can I read?" And I'm like, "No, you have to actually go and study the working papers and to do." Fuck, I don't know. Like, read everything. God damn it! Like, read everything that's ever existed on this topic. Just fucking go away. No, and you know, I'm an educator. I'm not against putting together reading lists, but sometimes I'm like, you cannot get all of this from one book. Mm-hmm. Like, stop it. Like, there are some times where, you know, even bookish. I am the king of the bookish people. All right, you know this about me. And I am the king of, like, ironically, we're both bitching about Marxology. I have devoted a fuck ton of my life to Marxology. But I find it wild that people think we can settle an argument about ecology on a textual reading or settle an argument about communism on a textual reading, because one of those things that I point out that, like, well, communism is supposed to be the abolition of class, period. And honestly, we haven't achieved that anywhere, you know, except for like hunter-gatherer societies in a very primitive sense, right? Like, and
perhaps Cambodia.
In the worst way. Yeah. In the sense that, like, death is equalized. Death is classless. Jesus. I'm just waiting for the Thanos full communism to be like, we have total equality through death. And I'm just like, I
feel like we're not that far away.
Somebody's gonna do it. It's gonna emerge on Twitter as a fucking meme, and someone's gonna actually make it real. Like, but anyway, go ahead.
But I did do some. I didn't do Marxology because I said specifically I'm not doing Marxology, but I did do a little bit of Leninology in it, because this whole thing started with the debates, like this reaction to an article defending Lenin's materialism and imperial criticism.
Which is my least favorite Lenin book. I'm just going to go ahead and say that right out. But
I didn't particularly care for it, but I thought it was fine. It was respectable. And part of the reason, what I learned when I was researching more of the context around it, was that particularly Russian positivism was full of quacks.
Yeah. I got that from your article, and I looked it up, and it's true. And I was like, oh. Yeah. I didn't really know, because I didn't.
Why would Lenin call these people solipsists, as in they don't believe in anything outside of their own mind, which is a really extreme thing to say in the philosophy. This is why, because they were insane and thought that, like, literally everything was, like, controlled by spirits, and epistemology was psychology and things like that.
That's like this one of the things that came up in your article that I've always thought about was, like, radical empiricism can go two ways. It can go the Hume way. I'm not sure that that's great or not. I don't totally know that I agree with the reading of the Hume way is just reactionary, but I can see how it kind of is. Or it can go the Bishop Berkeley way, which is like, well, our sense data is all we got to know. So, and I don't know anything really from that. So I'm just going to assume that God is everything. And, and I remember, frenemy of the show, Doug Lane, and I, one of our first debates ever, There was two. There's one on automation and labor theory of value, and Doug was doing his normal labor theory of value thing, and I was like, well, automation seems to be doing something that could really damage work. I don't know that it could replace work, but it could cause mass unemployment, etc., for a little while, and then it would adjust. And we were going back and forth on this, and I hadn't put together until actually answering the challenges of Stephen King, K-N-N-E, not King, but the challenges of Stephen King, that Marxism doesn't account for the value added by machines. It has a magical view of labor, and I'm like, no, machines are fixed capital, and fixed capital it reduces socially necessary labor time. Mm-hmm. So that would increase worker productivity, and so Marx has accounted for it. It's just not over time they will quit adding value, like, or it will quit enabling more value. It quit enabling more value to be extracted. That's actually probably the more technically correct way to say that. And productivity gains will slow down. And also price pressures will drop the price, so you'll get less profit per transaction. And that's perfectly already explained in Marx. It's not actually even that hard. But to be fair, I didn't figure that out until trying to answer the criticism, right? Like, oh, we do account for this. In fact, it's kind of important how we account for it. So, you're just kind of misstating what we believe. But we often don't, like, a lot of Marxists don't actually understand their categories. So it's, you don't have to even deal into the dregs of Twitter to get that. On your stuff on materialism, what I liked about your materialism article, we'll talk about it a little bit. This will come out way after I do a reading of it. I have some criticisms of it on whether or not we know, for example, that cognition is actually sign-based, because some of the reconstructions that you use, the same authors wrote another paper where they question some of the conclusions that they come up with. I cited in the thing, but they don't discard it. So I just had a little like mediating thing there, but I got a little bit snippy with Droughtarianism, but I
look forward to it.
Yeah, in general, though, one thing I think you're dead on about is one of the problems with Hegelian explanations of Marxism that aren't wrong. The Hegelian explanation isn't wrong. It's just not explaining to you actually how it works. And Marxist Hegelianism doesn't have ideals existing which you become aware of. Marxist Hegelianism, because it is materialist, has this idea of emergent ideas based off of the modes of production and also on the environment. I think people forget that. And if you add semiotics in there, that starts to make sense. It makes sense that it's non-arbitrary. It's that these emergences do matter, and there's relations between them, and those relations are mappable, and that mappable is something like a structural theory of knowledge. And I think it's important to look at structures. I think I point this out all the time, that people who don't look at structures often do very basic, even reasoning mistakes, where they like make a structural argument for something that's actually structurally identical to an argument for something else without realizing the consequences of that. But also in this deeper sense that, like, you have to look at the structures of society to try to change them. Like, you can't because if you don't look at the relations, you don't see the unintended knock-on effects. And this is to bring it back to the political will discussion and tie it into materialism. We do still think there will be unattended effects of material decisions, right? Like I know I do. Like, we don't know what all the planning decisions are actually going to do. Although hopefully under a socialist regime, we'd be better able to map out what they are and adjust to them. Like, because clearly the market's not doing it right fucking now. Like, Like, I don't know. People who tell me about market mechanisms for knowledge, I'm like, do you see how everything works today? Does it seem like it's working to you?
Yeah, it's like the sign of a price is not like it intentionally cuts off a lot of connections of what otherwise would be the knowledge of a commodity, right? That's part of the whole thing of commodity fetishism, and why like we need input-output planning and knowledge. Like with the thing with relations of production is similar to that. Like the relations of production is what Althusser creates his whole theory of ideology for, because the relations of production are created by the way people organize themselves, and they organize themselves based off of this knowledge that they create and these like relationships between different signs that they have and that they identify in the world and how they relate to them, and it's the whole thing. And the thing with creating new relations of production, it's not just a matter of like creating a new set of relationships requires creating a new system that because it's not just thinking that, although you do have to think that, it's creating something that makes sense, right? The way it actually works makes sense, so that people internalize it and keep doing it. Without that, it falls apart, like it did in the collective period in China, where even Mao was like, "Yeah, that didn't work out."
Right. I mean, or as it did in the various periods of the USSR, from the Red Terror to the NEP to high communism to war communism to whatever the fuck Khrushchev was doing. I don't know what we want to call that. And I do want to like point out, you're right. It's not just about getting your ideology right, because there's an interplay between ideology and material forces. And, you know what we call people who have ideologies that are completely disconnected from any material forces? We call them insane.
Yeah.
Like
the things that exist also have meaning to us, that they are signs that we recognize them, and they if you don't recognize those objective relations to them, then you're acting crazy.
Right. Like,
you have no relationship to what is actually going on around you.
And I mean, those probably have deep structures too, frankly, but still, you're right. Like we call people, and if one of those people who seem crazy, the material situation benefits them later, we will call them a visionary. But it's kind of an accident of history. Most people who project like that aren't. And this is like, I have this phrase that I used to throw at people. One of them that I call Marxio-Gnosticism, which was the idea that if you just understood some element of Marx, like how to get, for Doug Lane, it was how to get over the value form problem. For a lot of people, it's what is Marxist, typologies of history, and like how do we develop to that. And I'm not saying these questions aren't important, but I've always said like they're important, but like just knowing them or dealing with them does not produce a viable politics. Material questions have to eventually be answered materially, and that will change what you come up with. Like, and I don't think people sit with that enough in a very serious sense. And when it comes to ecology, that has real effects. And I've told people, people like, oh, you're too eclectic, because I incorporate Joseph Tainter into my understandings of Marxism, because I do think a lack of knowledge of complexity theory is a real limit. And we get what we get is like genealogical critiques. We were talking about like Althusser and Chris Catron was arguing with you, and his argument, which I don't even think is entirely false, actually, that some of Althusser's notions of materialism or Hellenistic or pre-Socratic or whatever. And that's somewhat true in that philosophically he was dealing with those traditions. It wasn't all he was dealing with. And like, so what? I could also say Marxist materialism is Hellenistic because his initial focus on what materialism was, which was a kind of formal materialism, not just the idea. It wasn't just material monism. I mean, it was that, but it wasn't just that, right? Like, it's based off of Epicurus and working through Epicurus in a Hegelian way, and then kind of doing what he does when he starts adding more and more scientific elements into it. Like, but at base, what got Marx started on that journey was a Hegelian reading of Epicurus. Like, so I don't understand those kinds of critiques. I don't get them. And I also think that we have to deal with the knowledge inherited of all of human history, and I don't think we're going to settle this by a Marxology debate. And I also don't think we can settle it by pure political will. That's my problem with Graeberism. Graeberism is like, basically, if you think another world impossible, it is. And I'm like, only if you build the stuff to make it possible. Like, and you know, maybe I can't build something that creates infinite widgets with no energy inputs. I don't know.
But here's the thing: is that it's not like even the thinking of it is like problematic in a very real sense. Is in this framework of we're talking about like relations of production that involve people thinking a certain way, and this whole thing of ideology is that people can't think a certain way because they're basically programmed not to. They're shaped by society and various institutions and apparatuses in it to think a certain way. And there's outliers in that, but people that is generally controlled. And there's this, I was reading one of Althusser's, it was a write-up of one of his lectures on psychoanalysis. And he mentions this pre-Lacanian school in France that had this phrase, not all those are mad who want to be. And that really got me thinking that, like, it's true that there are people who would like to just not to like to do things they're basically mad, and society doesn't let them because it needs them to do its own things. It normalizes it. It puts them into the it socializes them into being normal. And when ideological social reproduction breaks down, people act more mad because they want to be, including in violent ways.
Right. Oh yeah. I mean, that's what I talk about social contagion. I think it's an overused idea because I'm like, oh, people copying people mimetically is contagion because we always do that. What you're implying is there's a norm that's somehow being violated by copying. I hate to tell you, but there kind of isn't. And if there is, it's socially ideologically necessitaid. It is not inherent.
They just wanted an excuse to say mimetic, but yes.
Yeah. But
which is itself a mimetic contagion.
Yeah, mimetic is a mimetic contagion. Good old mimesis. But I should do an explainer video about mimesis and memes and mimetics. My favorite pseudoscience, it was almost a real science for 30 seconds, and the people realized, oh wait, this is a metaphor. It really did seem like I remember just hearing about memology in the aughts and in the 90s, and I was like, isn't that a metaphor? I mean, mimesis is a real thing, but like, aren't memes as a phoneme for gemes? Isn't that like just an analogy?
Yeah, I mean, like, so it really, like, once it became like evolutionary psychology, then it was dead. It was because that's not how it works. That's stupid. But you can think of that I think there is still a science to be made of sememes and like a harder version of semiotics that's possible out there. But it's not still a work in progress, which I partly blame Derrida for. He ruined everything with his stupid essays and critiques of Levi-Strauss and not.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I mean, oh man, the beginning of post-structuralism. That's well, people here will listen to me. I say a lot of postmodernism actually occurred because of socialist failure. See, socialism or Barbary leaving to Leotard, and we need to contextualize that. Derrida's separate from that. Derrida's something else. And Derrida's what happens when you huff a little bit too much Heidegger and you realize that you can terrorize people by obtuseness. Which is not to say that every Derrida book is bad. It's just I find that the Derrida books that are interesting are the ones that aren't read.
I honestly feel that the rise of Derrida and his kind of post-structuralism was a evolutionary attempt by academia as like a bourgeois state apparatus to suppress real social science. So that is my conspiracy theory. Because every time real social science emerges, this includes Marxian economics, they shut that shit down. They do not let that pass. They make sure that does not, because it has implications for eventually it'll come back to the bourgeoisie and the bourgeois relations of production, and they can't have that.
Yeah. Managers can read Das Kapital, but we can't have, other people reading it.
And you can read it as a literary text, not as an economic one.
Oh, we're not going to go off of that. I actually like Frederick Jameson a lot, but I don't forgive that. Reading Marx as a literary text. Fuck you. Sure, I can also read Adam Smith as a literary text, but no one does. I can read a whole thing about the metaphors in Adam Smith. The literary significance of his theory of moral sentiments or whatever. And I'm not saying no one does, but it is nowhere nearly as pervasive as people doing that to Marx. And then I'm always like, but the reactionaries are still going to be mad at you for teaching Marx at all, even if you're teaching it wrongly. So it's just, it is funny. I will say this. Marx, as was taught to me in college, was a totally bastardized Marx. And Althusser, as Althusser was taught to me in college, to be also frank, and even Bourdieu and people who are not necessarily Marxists were totally baldroized in literary criticism. I told you my first encounter with Althusser is being told to teach him in a literary theory context, and I read it and I was like, what the fuck does it have to do with literary theory at all? Ideological state apparatuses, woo! Okay.
I guess you could do something with interpolation, but it's like you would have to really work, honestly, to bring that. There was that one book I read that was The Poetics of Primitive Accumulation that did it was a meta kind of thing, because it was talking about because it did like a materialist analysis of the grammar schools in England and how that affected like the literature and stuff, which was kind of interesting. But
yeah, there was some. No, there was some good. One of the things I hate about postmodernism was like new historicism, not a paradigm I actually endorse. But that is at least based on actual history, and it's not just totally pulling out your butt.
It's so funny that and Evo Psych happened at the same time, like the maximum ass pull era of academia.
God, were you reading? I know you're younger than me, but like, there's this time period in the end of the aughts, around 2009 to like 2013, where there was this period like people trying to bring back vulgar materialism and literary criticism to get some of that science edge, even from Edge magazine. I remember this, like the one of the.
I don't even know what that is.
The Epstein brokers. So there's all these people combining Evo Psych, capitalist economics, and literary theory and narratology.
What? Why?
Yep. To argue that narratives operate like genes.
Oh, right. So this is what became of the memetics, right?
Yeah, this is after memetics died, but when people were still trying to make this work. Like,
I didn't know that. That's really funny. Even after,
like, I went to a narratology conference, which is, by the way, tells you I was a professor at the time, because why the fuck else would you go to that? And it was fine. I mean, it was, but I went to this whole section on like scientific narratology, and it was all that, and then also like evolution and the market and literature and the stories that last are all operating on the same evolutionary principles. And I was like, if capitalism operates off evolutionary principles, 99.9% of everything should die. Like, it's just, it's just like, I don't think you realize what you mean. Like,
are they talking about like actual biological evolution, or as like a metaphor?
I think they meant it literally, but it was one of those times where it's kind of vague, where like with the development of memetics itself, do they mean this literally, or is it an analogy? As an analogy, I think it's still bad, but like but at least it's defensible as a literal claim. I mean, you know what that does? It brackets out all the social sciences, not just the humanities. It brackets out all the social sciences too, and subordinates the humanities to, like, you know, whatever hard physics or evolutionary theory you want to subordinate them to.
You know what I think is a better metaphor for like memetic spread, especially with regard to like innovations in statecraft and like the evolution of the state, is crystalline structures. Because what happens sometime, and the stability of crystalline structures, because if you create a new version of a crystal in its structure that is more stable than like the old version, suddenly that, when you put like a little seed crystal of that somewhere, it takes over, and you can't get the other one anymore because it's just contaminated with the new version. And the only places that are free from that are places that weren't contaminated. And it's not quite biological reproduction, but I think it's the closest thing in the natural world to how that works, basically.
That makes sense. Well, on that note, I would wrap us up today. Where can people find your work, Nico?
So they can find my blog on Substack, A Prehistory of the Encounter. And I also publish sometimes on Cosmonaut and sometimes in Palladium. And I have Twitter, Bluesky, with my name. So that's how you can find me.
All right. Thank you so much. And we will see you again, because we have like 3 other shows planned, and I'll spread you out over the next few months. But yes, so you can also find Nico here probably about every 2 months. All right. Take care.